Es un gran honor el tener entre nosotros a Jean-Pierre Brun, como todos ustedes saben, un especialista de primerísimo nivel a nivel mundial, y él nos va a hablar sobre el tema que ven en la imagen, estas canteras imperiales de granito de Latomia, Egipto, y no quiero robarle tiempo para que, bueno, pues, que podamos disfrutar todos de esta conferencia, que seguro va a ser muy provechosa. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias por la invitación a Madrid. Just a few words to start with. The title on the program is La carrière impériale de granit de Domitianè-Kainé Latomia, Egypt. That you are expecting a presentation in French, but I decided to make it in English, thinking it would be more suitable for an international conference in Madrid, where I suppose the majority of the audience understands English. I would like to present today our excavations on the imperial quarry of Balad in the eastern desert of Egypt. We did these excavations in 2002-2003 with Hélène Cuvigny, Alain Budo-Jacobsen, and Michel Rédé. We learned from the ostraca found during these excavations that this quarry bore the name of Domitianè when it was opened. Then, after the damnatio memoriae of this emperor in AD 96, the quarry bore the more politically correct name of Kainé Latomia, thus the new quarry. This quarry was indeed new in comparison with the Porphyritis quarry, which was opened in the same mountains under Tiberius in AD 18. Even if the new quarry was located in the Jebel Dohan mountains, the stone extracted was not porphyry, but granodiorites, similar than the one of Mons Claudianus, but somewhat darker. The stone is known in Rome with the name Granito Verde Fiorito di Biggio. This quarry was discovered by Baron and Hume in 1902, they published a short description in their book about the geology of Eastern Desert. In 1930, Skyfe conducted a more detailed survey studying the fort, the quarries, and the worker village that he published in 1935. The site was visited several times thereafter. In January 2000, when we were excavating the Roman way fortress of Didymoy, we found that the rubbish dump in front of the fort has been looted. Clandestine excavations unearthed ceramics and ostraca. We decided to interrupt our ongoing research on the route from Coptos to Berenike to organize a rescue excavation on the site of Balad. This operation necessitated 2 campaigns in 2002 and 2003. The site includes a fortress, several buildings, all around the fort, such as smithy, stables, a temple, cemetery, and up in the wadi, 2 quarries and a workers' village. The fort was located on the terrace. It was reached by a flattened road, 8 to 14 meters wide. The fort forms a rectangle about 48 meters by 37, as the one on, so you can see it here on the, I don't know if there is a, no, there's nothing. Anyway, so you can see the fort is the black on the right, and the quarries at the end of the wadi. As the other fort of Mons Claudianus and Mons Ophiates, the corners have no towers, but as you can see, but the entrance is defended by two towers, 2.5 meter wide. You can see it at the entrance. When we excavated the gate, we discovered several fragments of the dedication inscription engraved on a limestone slab used on both sides. On the one side was certainly written the dedication of the time of Domitian. On the other, the text was revised after the damnatio memoriae of this emperor. An outer clavicula protected the entrance. We cannot be sure that it was built with the fort. The example of Mons Claudianus, where the clavicula has been built later, suggests a later construction, probably toward the middle of the 2nd century. Inside the fort, an alley leads to a large room located at the end, so in blue. Two blocks of rooms line the alley. Other blocks are arranged along the curtain wall, as you can see, and they are served by narrow lanes. The entire western part of the fort, that I called Block A, is occupied by a set of rooms located against the western wall. The block includes living quarters for the staff and a large tank occupying the central room number 3. To the back wall of this room, this back wall is occupied by 3 rectangular niches coated with clay covered with a layer of lime and paintings. The central niche revealed the presence of an incense burner and of a male head statue made of painted clay. The presence of the 3 niches, their decoration, and the discovery of a fragment of the statue indicate that it was the location of the sanctuary when the fort was built. The central part of room 3 is occupied, as we have seen, by a large cistern, which could contain about more than 200,000 liters. The cistern is fed by a pipe to a tank built near the entrance. The water was brought from outside by water skins, which were emptied into the tank. Room 3 gave access to 2 other rooms, 74 and 75. The room 74 is the only one that is paved. It links to another one, the floor which contained several ostraca addressed to the centurion Caninius Dionysius. The discovery of these letters and the link with the sanctuary in room 3 indicates that this couple of rooms were part of the praetorium, that's the accommodation of the commander of the fort. In the southwestern part of the fort, a corridor leads to a small bath complex, which was part of the original design, as the bathtub drain pipe was clearly planned when the rampart was built. Room 36 contained a boiler form of a hearth, which was heating a metal pot surrounded by a vertical wall of clay. A door gave access to room 90, its floor and the inside walls are covered with lime plaster and red paintings, and a bathtub, as you can see, occupies the entire north side of the room. The size of the rooms of Block B and the internal division indicates that there were barracks, contuberna, type Arma and Papilio, which were occupied by the soldiers. Block E, as you can see in this plan, has an irregular appearance. It was built in 3 stages, marked by addition of rooms whose walls are based on previous constructions. Belonging to the first phase, room 7 which is in the right of the slide, this room was probably a granary. The final stage of Block E, so the central one, is marked by the addition at the western hand by room 17, which has a flagstone floor forming a corridor between two benches here. The plan has parallel to shrines of the eastern desert, such as Djinumoy and Kusu al-Banat. The ceramic material discovered in the occupation layers of this room is dated from the early 3rd century AD. The dump extended over 200 square meters southeast of the door and a volume about of 80 cubic meters. The stratigraphy is simple because the waste was spread horizontally, and the sharp decline of the volume of organic matter led to a simplification of the natural succession of layers. Essentially, the strata consist of gravel mixed with organic matter decomposed. The arch levels are limited to lenses. The architectural development of the fort and the study of Ostraka have shown that the site was occupied 3 times and under Domitian, Nerva, and Trajan, 2nd time under Antoninus Pius, and 3rd time under the Severi. But abandonment phase, if we can go back to the section, the abandonment phase are not marked in the stratigraphy because no sediment is brought by the wind in this rocky environment. The barracks of the fort were found as they were abandoned, except for the stones that fell from the walls, and the surface of the dump was just as the Roman army left it. Around the fort, there are scattered several buildings. I only mention the most significant for our purpose. A building located 100 meters southeast of the fort consists of 2 rooms and can be interpreted as tables. 100 meters north of the fort, the rocky hill is crowned by a small square building to be interpreted as a scopelos, such as a watching post. So this is the tower on the hill. Under the scopelos, there was a smithy, essential for forging tools used in the quarry. In the first phase, the blacksmith worked outdoors, generating a mass of ash and iron slags, about 10 centimeters thick, and you can see it here on the right side of the slide. In a second phase, a square building was built, leaning against the rock wall. It included a bench used as a bed, a forge, and a tank with a capacity of 12 liters, used for quenching the forge tools. The rarity and the banality of ceramics found in the smithy meant that we cannot date the 2 phases. I am tempted to date the first phase from the Domitian period and the second from the Antoninian occupation of the fort, but only tentatively. 280 meters northwest of the fort, there is a shrine that was built halfway up to the mountain at the altitude of 600 meters, thus some 60 meters above the fort. The sanctuary, measuring 6 meters by 5 meters, included a main cellar opening to the south and designed with a central niche to house the statue of the god, A second cella was added later on the east face, here in blue. In the initial phase, so in purple, the facade included two massive pylons, clearly influenced by the entrance of the Egyptian temples. The shrine was in a very bad state due to erosion and to the destructions carried out by treasure hunters, who smashed the floor of the cellar and the main niche. I could not get any information on the nature of worship, any statue, inscription, or ex voto having been removed by looters. There is also a cemetery which lies 200 meters southeast of the fort. I counted 15 graves covered with piles of stones. All were looted when we arrived. The excavation of some of them showed the presence of adults and a toddler. The buried people are mostly men, robust, too poor to have their corpses transported and buried in the valley. From the fort, a road leads to a village of quarrymen built at the foot of the eastern side of the mountain. You can see here the fort, the road, and in the upper part, the village of the quarrymen. This village is formed of 18 cells, some with stone benches. Hélène Cuvigny's recent paper on the toponymy of the Eastern Desert suggests that this village was called Arabarques, getting its toponym from a personal name known at Thebai. We know that that name because of an amphora wine which was sent to Socrates, who was architect at Arabarques. From the workers' village, two paths led to the granite quarries, and you can see them here in the mountain. Two quarries were opened successively on the western side of the mountain opposite the village. I called Quarry A the oldest quarry that you can see on the slide at the altitude of 700 meters. And there is a second quarry at the altitude of 830 meters. That is called Quarry B. The path leading to Quarry A reached an artificial platform bordered to the east by a high retaining wall. You can see on the center of the slide. The floor, which is covered with a layer of charcoal and iron slag, showing that there was a blacksmith workshop on the platform. So this is the plan of the Quarry A with the path, the retaining wall, the stone, and this small building, which can be interpreted as a smithy. The working faces, as you can see here, and this is the wall, retaining wall, and the working faces are dotted with lines of wedge holes used to extract the blocks. The wedge holes are of the same type the one at the Mons Claudianus and the Porphyritis, showing an identical technique of rock extraction by iron wedges hammered between two feathers, small sheets of iron called in the ostraca paraspernia. The working face show that the rectangular blocks of medium size were extracted. Several semi-finished blocks ready to be transported down the slipway are lying at the top of the slipway. A block found in the wadi bear the inscription RPP, Requisitum Patrimoni Porfiritu, indicating that the administration considered that Kainé Latomia was part of the Metallon Porfiritu, which is logical since this quarry is located in the same mountain of the Porphyrites, whose importance and anteriority were obvious. The block extracted from the quarry were carried down through the two slipways that we can see here. So this two slipways down the wadi, so down the valley. The north slipway is lined as the one at Mons Claudianus and at Porphyrites by cylindrical structures which an average diameter of 2 meters, built with waste stones. They were probably used for fastening the ropes used to slow the descent of the blocks rather than being piles of stones held in reserve for the construction of the slipways, which is an hypothesis of David Peacock that I don't share. Quarry B, north of Quarry A, halfway up the mountain, can be reached by two paths. The quarry is designed as a roughly triangular working area divided into two terraces. The lower terrace north is bordered by a high retaining wall up to 10 meters. The west face of the quarry is prepared for the extraction of granite blocks. The upper terrace, so this is the lower terrace here, the upper terrace is here. The upper terrace is bordered by a long retaining wall. Its surface shows several blocks with wedge holes. Toward the southeast, a passage of 5 meters wide links Quarry B to the slipway. This corridor was designed to allow the evacuation of blocks, but it was never completed. A rock pan lies in the middle and was not removed. This is the corridor and the slipway, and you can see the parts that were not removed. Then this is the unfinished corridor. The original plan was to build a slipway from the quarry to the road leading to the village in order to offload the blocks. The upstream segment of this slipway, here you can see the working face in Quarry B, and the slipway. The upstream segment of the slipway was completed, but the downstream segment to the village has not been finished. The unfinished slipways ends abruptly on a rock head. Summarizing all the data, we can determine 5 phases in the history of the site. The first consists of the construction of the fort between AD 89 and AD 91. The blocks A, B, C1, D1, E1, and F1 were built. The block A was occupied by the staff of the fort. Room 3, vital because of the cistern, also served as a sanctuary where 3 deities were worshipped. We know nothing about these gods, but in the other quarries, Zeus, Helios, Megalos, Serapis occupied the central place with other gods who shared the same temples, as we have many inscriptions of that. On either side of the Sacellum, rooms are linked to it. We can identify them as the commander living quarters. And one of this room, room 74, was probably used as an office and meeting room whose floors were paved. From the same time certainly date the beginning of extraction in Quarry A, the construction of the main slipway, and the building of the worker village, at least some of the cells. Then we have a phase 2, which is an abandonment period between AD 100 and AD 146. The activity in the imperial quarry was intermittent, but it generated many documents found on Ostraka. The organization of the quarry works needed a huge bureaucracy. For example, scribes had to establish lists of workers sent to the quarries in order to distribute the water and other goods. Thus, the lack of ostraka, dated between the year 100 and the year 146, indicates almost certainly a period of abandonment, which is thus the phase 2. Then we have a phase 3, which is characterized by an increase in the number of rooms inside the fort. New cells were built, whether it was possible, so C2, D2, etc. And some passages were removed in order to build new rooms. This clearly marks an increase in activity, which took place toward the middle of the 2nd century, when the ostraka show intense activity from 146 up to 151. I think we can relate the construction of new stables in Build 6 and the preparatory works undertaken in Quarry B to this intense phase. As we have seen, the works were not completed and this quarry was never exploited. The blocks that were extracted were used to build retaining walls, and the slipway remained unfinished, nor indeed the access corridor to the quarry completed. I propose the following hypothesis. When very significant works were undertaken by Antoninus Pius, notably the completion of the Temple of Venus in Rome, the imperial administration put maximum effort into the operation at the quarries of the eastern desert of Egypt, where we witnessed renewed extractions at Mons Ophiates, at Tiberiane, at Mons Claudianus, and at the Porphyritis. At Kainé Latomia, this effort ended in failure. The new quarry B may not given the expected results, probably because the bedrock was cracked and because it was impossible to extract large blocks, such as big columns as the Mons Claudianus. But the bad quality of the rock was already known from previous works. An alternative explication is thus possible. The dark granite was probably extracted only for cutting decorative slabs for flooring, when after the mid-2nd century, major works in Rome came to an end, including the Temple of Venus in Rome. The administration decided generally to stop work in the desert quarries and focused on only 2 large ones, those of Mons Claudianus and Porphyritis. We know that during the second half of the 2nd century, the exploitation decreased even at Mons Claudianus and at Porphyritis, and that Mons Ophiates quarry was abandoned in the second half of the 2nd century. Phase 4 corresponded thus to a phase of abandonment soon after AD 151. The abandonment seems to have lasted at least half a century. Phase 5 is characterized by reoccupation of the fort for a short period of time, perhaps no more than a couple of months. During this phase, the fort was already partially ruined and it was reoccupied only in part. The old sanctuary was abandoned and a kitchen was installed against the northern niche, room 74 and 75 were cleaned. It is in these rooms that the centurion Caninus Dionysius took up residence, as shown by the letters we found there. A new sanctuary was built then in room 17, which included, as I told you, a central corridor and benches. The objects found in the layers of this phase are dated to the late second and early 3rd century. How can we explain this reoccupation? I could not identify any level of waste on the external dump, and there were only few shards thrown on the surface, and the ceramics found in the fort are rare. My interpretation of the reoccupation of the Severian period is as an inspection tool for informing the administration on whether or not to reopen the quarry. It is significant that the centurion resides locally. We know that it is a centurion, Caius Cominius Legas, who was sent to the desert under Tiberius to discover porphyry and to open the quarries at the Porphyritis. Other centurions, Annius Rufus, Valvinius Priscus, and Avitus, were commanding at the Mons Claudianus at the time of the great extraction works necessitated by the construction of the Forum of Traian between AD 110 and 118. Under Antoninus, at the peak of activity, the centurion Plotinus was in charge at the Claudianus, and another centurion is also attested in Mons Ophiates in AD 150. So the administration could have sent a centurion to inspect the quarry in order to decide about its reopening, in which occasion, for this period, we think, of course, of the construction of the Septizonium by Septimus Severus, or the decoration of the flooring of the bath of Caracalla, whose structural work began in 211 and that were completed in 216. The report of the centurion was probably negative, and the quarry was not reopened. It was a second failure, and the scarcity of granit Kainé Latomia in Rome is a reflection of these failures, albeit the massive investment in labor force and capital to pay salaries and equipment. This failure was due to bad choice by the imperial administration, blinded by its desire for prestige to the point of wasting huge resources on a poorly planned project. But this type of failure is not a prerogative of the government of the past, as we learn every day. Examining the two small quarries A and B of Kainé Latomia provide several lessons for the organization of extraction work. Given the difficulty of the environment, implementing a new quarry necessitated the setting up of a base camp, the fort, and a communication network, the roads to the valley, and the digging of wells and cisterns. Then it was necessary to build a camp base to prevent workers returning every night to the fort. Then from this basis, the fort and the village, paths were made to reach the rocky banks and to bring men and tools. And you can see this path. There is one linking the fort to the quarry directly, and we have seen the other ones from the quarry village, from the workers' village to the quarries themselves. These paths were wide enough to allow the passage of donkeys for any transportation. The third step was to build terrace using raw blocks in order to work easily, and to build a blacksmith to forge the tools several times a day. The ostraca from Mos Claudianus, published by Adam Below-Jacobsen in his book The Quarry Text, issued in 2009, provide a clear insight into the role of the smith and their heads. The proportion between the number of smiths versus quarrymen is 1 to 15. Only when all these stages were done could the actual extraction begin, and slipways were built to get the block down to the road. When the imperial administration decided to put an end to the exploitation, only the quarry A was under exploitation. The working faces were prepared. The quarrymen had extracted some blocks, which were roughly cut. Some had been transported as far as the road, since 5 of them were abandoned there, but others were certainly brought to Rome. Quarry B, on the contrary, was far from being operational. The terraces were built, 2 major quarry faces were prepared, and they were not worked because the slipway was not completed. Thus, no block has ever come from this quarry. Unlike Quarry A, there is no cluster of rock chips attesting that blocks were wrapped, and I found very few pottery sherds testifying to a short-term operation. In sum, it is likely that the Romans spent most of the time planning the operation and preparing the work, building the fort, village, the shrine, etc. But because of the poor quality of the stone, the order to stop the work came when the complex was barely operational and even unfinished. The first period, which lasted a decade at the very end of the 1st century AD, would correspond to the start of the operation in Quarry A. The second period, which lasted about 5 years toward the middle of the 2nd century, if we follow the date given by the ostraca, focused on the recovery of Quarry A and the opening of Quarry B. The first attempt in the early 3rd century was probably limited to an inspection, perhaps some test, but no real work in the quarry. In conclusion, I would like to replace Domitianè-Kainé Latomia in the complex of the granite and porphyry quarries of the eastern desert of Egypt. The opening of quarries in this hostile region was decided toward the end of the reign of Augustus and under Tiberius. On the one hand, old quarries such as the Basanites quarries of the Wadi el-Hamamat were reopened, and on the other hand, instance surveys were conducted by military specialists such as Caius Cominius Legas, who discovered the porphyry deposit of the Jebel Doran in AD 18. The oldest granite quarry complex opened by the Roman administration is of Mos Ophiates in the Wadi Samna Wadi Wikala sector. A dedication to Pan dated from AD 10 gives the quarry name, the date of foundation of the temple, and probably of the entire complex, and the name also of the freedman Poppius Juventus Agathopus, who led the works under the authority of the prefect of the desert of Berenike. We can identify the stone quarried from Mos Ophiates as the marble called Augusteum by Pliny. Another inscription found in a Roman site near the gold mine of Wadi Samna, 10 kilometers northwest of Mos Ophiates, bear the name of Ulpius Humerus with the title of Procurator Metallorum. It attests that the quarry was still operating under Antoninus Pius, but the survey conducted in the years 1997-2000 by a US team composed under the direction of Steve Sidebottom show that this praedium, and we can see on the slide, which included a well and the settlement for the quarrymen, was abandoned soon after the middle of the 2nd century and never reoccupied. The second granite quarry was the one opened under Tiberius at precisely Tiberianè, now Barud, 10 kilometers south of Mons Claudianus. The name is given by the ostraca found by the British mission, and it seems that the marmor Tiberium is a rather black granite used precisely for paving floors on the palace of Tiberius on the Palatine. The excavation and surveys were rather disappointing because the British mission found only remains from the Antonine period in the fort and in the rubbish dump. But I think there are a first stage of the fort that has escaped us because, as elsewhere, the barracks were periodically cleaned. The first settlement was probably poorly fortified and similar to those of Wadi Vikala. The towers were added later during the 2nd century. The object and ostraca of the mid-2nd century would date only the Antonine quarrying phase, which seems to be intense everywhere in the desert. The first exploitation of the porphyry quarries at Porphyritis date from the Tiberian period. Works were carried out for 5 centuries, but not permanently. Under Tiberius and Claudius, small quarries and villages called by the British mission Foot and Bradford village were active. Then under Nero and the Flavians, new villages called Northwest and Southwest were built for exploiting the nearby quarries. Under Domitian, a large fort and a new well were created. At least 2 temples were built shortly after. The Temple of Isis was dedicated in AD 113, and the Temple of Serapis in AD 117. From this period dates the exploitation of the Lepsius and Lycabitius quarries. Toward the middle of the 2nd century, the intense activity in the Lepsius and Lycabitius quarries necessitated the construction of a fort and stables at Badia, as well as stables and cisterns at Sidri. During the second half of the 2nd century, activity appears much less intense, but there was a renewal during the Severian period, marked by the construction of new workers' village near the Lycabitius quarries. The troubles of the last third of the 3rd century probably caused the abandonment of the quarry. Then, at the beginning of the 4th century, the fort was reoccupied and new working phases were opened at the Lepsius and Lycabitius quarries. The intense activity explained the construction of long slipways regularly flanked by pairs of cairns, you can see here. This period is dated by inscription, coins, and pottery, which indicate that the site was operated until about AD 425. Then the quarries were definitely abandoned. The history of Mons Claudianus is much shorter. The quarry was opened under Claudius and exploited at the beginning around the worker village incorrectly called the Idroma. The main phase began under Domitian, who ordered the construction of the fort in AD 86, and the extraction of granite for the decoration of the Domus Flavia. This fort was necessary because of the growing insecurity in the area observed along the routes to Myosormos and Berenike. From this base, the quarries were fully exploited for Trajan's Forum, then for the Villa Adriana, and then under Antoninus for the Temple of Venice and Rome. The Antonine period is marked by several improvements, such as the construction of large granaries and animal lines. After this period of intense activity, the quarry is less used during the second half of the 2nd century. But there is a renewal during the Severian period, in particular for the decoration of Caracalla's bath in Rome. And after Severus Alexander, the quarry is definitely abandoned toward AD 235. In this context, we observe that the Kainé Latomia quarry follows the main phase of exploitation of other imperial quarries. The role of Domitian is fundamental everywhere, at Mons Claudianus, at Porphyritis, and at Kainé Latomia. He built forts and increased the extraction. This activity continued under Trajan. There is another peak under Antoninus, marked by intense activity at Mons Ophiates, at Tiberiane, and at Mons Claudianus and Porphyritis. And it appears also that the reign of Antoninus is not only a very important phase of extraction, but also a period of rationalization of the transport. The last peak occurred under the Severi, when Porphyritis and Mons Claudianus were reactivated, and when the administration sent a centurion to evaluate the opportunity to reopen the quarries of Kainé Latomia. We have seen that there was no happy ending for this quarry. Thank you.